Welcome to the European Forum for Urban Security's SecU4All podcast. SecU4All aims to empower local and regional authorities to ensure the security of soft targets in public spaces against potential threats. In each of these episodes, experts from our consortium join to explore a different aspect of making and keeping public spaces open, accessible and safe for everyone. Our first two episodes dealt with identifying, prioritizing, and then fixing security problems in our public spaces. But, of course, there are problems beyond our immediate control, and for all our best efforts, things can always go wrong. And sometimes they go very wrong, very quickly, and then you have a crisis on your hands. In which case you need to do two things. You need to manage the crisis, obviously, but you also need to credibly assure people that you are managing the crisis. It is exactly that element of crisis management communication that we're going to talk about today. And for that, I am joined by Cristina Carafili of the Center for Security Studies KEMA. Welcome, Cristina.
Hello, Lawrence.
Could you briefly tell us a bit about KEMA and your role there?
The Center for Security Studies, KEMA, is a think tank on homeland security policies and an established research center since 2005 within the Hellenic Ministry of Citizen Protection to support national and European projects and security policy implementations in Greece at the strategic level, in close cooperation with law enforcement agencies. A main objective of KEMA is to bring together all national law enforcement agencies and to enable them to collaborate, interconnecting them with corresponding agencies and research institutions and industry from around Europe. I am a project manager at KEMA in both national and European projects relevant to risk and threat assessment and terrorism attacks, crisis management and communication.
And why did you decide to join the project consortium?
KEMA participates in a series of research ISTP projects such as COBRA, MaskCBRN, Protect, Prosperous, and SecU4All, focusing on enhancing protection of public spaces, urban areas, and other soft targets via development, implementation, and rollout of new security solutions, trainings, exercises, sharing of best practices, and awareness-raising activities.
Could you quickly explain what the ISFP is and what it stands for?
Of course. The Internal Security Fund Police is the instrument for financial support for police cooperation, preventing and combating crime and crisis management. It sets out two specific objectives. The first one is crime prevention, combating cross-border, serious and organized crime, including terrorism, while the second objective is enhancing the capacity of member states and the European Union and protecting people and critical infrastructures against terrorist attacks and other security-related incidents.
Great, thank you. Now, if we bring this down to the urban level, how do you think about cities? What makes them interesting for a crisis manager?
Cities constitute political, economic, and cultural power. They include important, critical, and soft infrastructures and have developed substantial communications transport networks. Attacks targeting city spaces can result in widespread media coverage, ensuring visibility to the attackers and their goals. Bombings and armed assaults are the most common forms of terrorism in most European regions. So, the last decade, the European Union has increased significantly the security in its all domains. And effectively, the attacks have shifted from hard targets that are primarily affect state and institutions to soft targets that are easier to be executed and have direct impact in smaller communities and societies. So this shift to soft targets generates a high end pressure on local and public institutions and authorities to create a clear communication in crisis in order to respond to such attacks and strengthen the resilience of the community.
It's interesting that you bring it up because from that perspective, the current threat level that we are facing can be viewed as a consequence of successful policy. Before we go on, could you define crisis communication in a city for me? What is the professional understanding of it?
There is no universally accepted definition of a crisis. This is an unstable condition involving an abrupt or significant change that requires urgent attention and action to protect the life, assets, property, or the environment. And an aspect vital to successful management is crisis communication. This concept is especially emphasized in the protection of public spaces, since crisis management in public spaces requires a joint effort and coordination of multidisciplinary actors from the public and the private sector, also involving the general public. Cities have an important role in communication during crisis. They need to have the necessary tools, knowledge, and skills in place in terms of communication strategies and plans for effectively and efficiently responding to a crisis situation.
Can you help me break that down a little more? What are some essential elements, some necessary parts?
It's a complex procedure, always depending on the type of crisis and the institutions and authorities involved. There are some main elements. Internal communication refers to the communication processes specifically within the crisis management team. Horizontal communication between different actors and agencies is required. In addition, crisis communication entails an external communication strategy of reports regarding a crisis status, warning messages, and guidelines to the general public. This strategy is addressed to external stakeholders, defined as general public, private entities, and other public authorities. The strategy includes communication with the public and other stakeholders prior, during, and after crisis, information about the crisis, warnings, directions, and required actions as part of the crisis management, mitigation, response, and recovery activities.
When you say public and other stakeholders, who are those?
Generally, at the European level, actors and agencies responsible for crisis communication in public spaces include local municipalities, law enforcement agencies, fire services, emergency medical services, civil protection, private security agencies and operators, citizens and the general public, and urban planners. And there is a turn towards local authorities undertaking a core role in public space protection.
And when you're trying to get these stakeholders to become active members of your crisis communication strategy, of your plans, what is your sales pitch? What are the tangible benefits that you present to people?
A crisis communication is important as it can prevent the onset or escalation related to terrorism during a crisis. It can impact its course, reduce or increase duration and severity of consequences, as well as the degree of potential reputational damage to crisis actors. Crisis communication in pre-crisis focuses on risk possibilities, awareness of a general response plan in case of an attack, potential impact of an attack on different segments of the community, and identifying short, medium, and long-term needs in case of an attack. During the crisis communication focuses on dealing with the crisis. Main benefits of good communication are the identification of the incident, activation of the crisis management team and the communications team that can be part of the crisis management team, collection and processing of information for decision making, and establishment of internal communication messages and dissemination of crisis messages to both internal and external stakeholders. Benefits after crisis are the limitation and the resolution of the incident with the least possible consequences, and the guarantee of public confidence in the local authorities.
You said before, during, and after a crisis, but What are those tipping points, or who gets to decide if a city is in crisis?
You identify when you are in a crisis, when the management team, the crisis management team, needs to be deployed and take actions. So initially, communication relevant to this crisis is the internal one, identifying the crisis and trying to coordinate response. And then external communication is developed. Of course, the communication is working both ways. The general public also informs the authorities and the crisis management teams that there is a situation evolving. So they could also start their actions towards mitigating the results and responding to this situation. But in terms of large events such as terrorist attacks, usually the event needs to be assessed by the management team in order to be labeled as an incident of major or national importance.
By splitting it into pre, during, and after crisis, you are already hinting at that famous crisis response cycle. Can we do the same thing for a crisis? So, is there such a thing as a life cycle to a crisis?
Okay, so basically it occurs in distinct stages. The first stage is the confusion. It usually happens from the time that the event presents itself and 1 hour approximately after the event. This includes rumors and new alerts arising. Stage 2 concerns rescue operations and investigations that happen 2 to 3 hours after the event and includes initial information and condemnation and reports. Stage 3 concerns the institutional statements that are reports focusing on details and footage available happening 3 to 4 hours after the situation. And stage 4 is the start of normalization of the scene. The full media coverage focusing on damage, victims, perpetrators, and happens after the 4 hours of an event. Of course, this concerns mostly the response phase of the crisis. And while the recuperation to normality includes stage 5, concerning core functions of recovery and rebuilding confidence, with backgrounds and the crisis management actions presented and high media coverage. And stage 6, in terms of crisis communication, includes lessons learned and the return to the normality that happens sometimes even 3 days after the event. This includes the declining media interest, focusing on the impacts and backgrounds of the crisis.
So, throughout the last minutes, you've described a pretty complex set of challenges. Now, when it comes down to training people to be able to deal with those challenges, how do you structure the training sessions and what are the goals that you set for yourself there?
The Secure for All exercises bring together stakeholders in order to process and to evaluate communication readiness for crisis management, disaster recovery, and business continuity. Realistic use cases scenarios are presented in an engaging, low-stress environment where stakeholders divided in working groups walk through their communication methods for corresponding and responding to the unfolding crisis situation. Benefits are the ability to identify key definitions relevant to crisis communication, to identify the crisis communication aspects during each phase of the crisis cycle, to understand the objectives of each phase of the crisis communication, recognize the relevant stakeholders, and identify the need of cooperation and interoperability between them. Also, they understand basic principles of messaging pre, during, and after a crisis situation, and the relevant communication channels.
And if we look at it the other way around, what are some major pitfalls in crisis communication that you're trying to get people to avoid in those trainings?
typical pitfalls are that the messages towards the general population are complex, using technical terms or specialized expressions, which raise new questions and perhaps doubt in the public. Also, they are not conveyed in a timely manner and are not repeated enough so that the message is clearly understood. Also, the lack of consistency, sometimes having conflicting statements or estimates from different entities, causing confusion to the general public. Local authorities need to understand that communication is not only about sharing communication with internal and external stakeholders, but also includes understanding and hearing their needs. They need to establish a situation where speculations and confusion does not prevail and be consistent and transparent. Communication messages need to be simple and based on facts in order to secure societies as much as possible from anxiety, panic, and uncontrollable rumors in public opinion, creating false perceptions of the real situation, poor assessment of risk and threats, creating a negative image for authorities and for the ability of their human resources to effectively deal with an emergency situation. Subsequently, damaging the authorities' reputation too. Communication, so, is often experienced as ineffective, despite the largely functional and technical communication infrastructures available from the local authorities. Challenges include breakdowns in information flow and low quality of information provided. Also, the amount of information communicated is not always the appropriate for the scale of the crisis situation.
When you say it's often experienced as ineffective, is there a more objective way of gauging that a crisis communication strategy is successful?
I do believe that there is no way in measuring the crisis communication effectivity unless you separate the events and understand how you responded in each phase of the crisis. So the assessment should be divided in pre-crisis, during, and after crisis. And you need to take under consideration both internal communication and external communication with the public. So you need to review the crisis situation in terms of crisis management and the communication between the stakeholders involved in resolving the situation, and also assess if the message is conveyed to the general public and other authorities were well received and followed.
And in your opinion, how frequently should one review such a strategy?
Every time a crisis arises, an organization should go back and review the crisis communication procedures based on the results of this crisis and how they handle it. Usually, preparation for crisis communication includes several topics. The one concerns preparedness and mitigation phase, including crisis management cycle, enhancement of resilience of the society, following EU guidance and legislation, and crisis communication plans development. The second part of the communication during crisis relates to the response phase, with categorization of incidents, cooperation and interoperability aspects, and handling the crisis. While the third one is relevant to recovery phase, analyzing topics such as business continuity and recuperation to normality. So every time a crisis arises, you need to go back and review all these procedures in order to be able to respond more effectively in the next one.
We are approaching the end and we have covered quite a bit of ground, but of course not everything. So if listeners want to learn more about crisis communication, the projects that you mentioned in the beginning, or your work in general, where can we find additional resources on this?
KEMA has a website. It's www.kemea.gr. It includes all relevant information concerning the work concerning research and development project, training of practitioners, and certification. And you can also find highlights of all the projects that the center is involved in. So you are welcome to visit the website and the relevant social media in order to find more information about both KEMA and the projects that we are involved in.
All right, we'll link to those in the description. That about wraps it up for today and this episode on crisis communication. So, Christina, thank you very much for your time and your answers.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. For additional information on our partners' work and the Secure4All project, please follow the links in the description. Secure4All is funded by the European Union's Internal Security Fund and coordinated by Efus, the European Forum for Urban Security. You can find us online at efus.eu or on Twitter under @EfusNews, that's @EFUSNEWS. This episode was produced and recorded by me, Lauren Schätzle, for the German European Forum for Urban Security, with the kind support of the Secure4All project team at Efus.